Another great spot from which to see the city is the top of Giotto's bell tower that stands right here in front of the Duomo. You can also climb to the top of the dome itself. There's a public gallery from which you can see the city down below. It's only about 400 steps to get up there, so let's give it a try and climb up Giotto's bell tower and have a look down on the rooftops of Florence. Huff and puff your way up. You even have to pay to get in there. It costs about $3 to walk up the staircase, and the payoff is worth it. You get to the top and you have an unparalleled view of one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Campanile del Duomo is 276 feet tall. It was completed in 1348, which makes it nearly 100 years older than the dome next door that was completed by Brunelleschi. And you can step right outside on the parapet to get a clear, unobstructed view of the city. It's called Giotto's Tower, but he actually died just as construction began. So it was completed by another great architect called Andrea Pisano. View of San Lorenzo Church. You can see Palazzo Vecchio, and you can spot many of the landmarks of the city, including the Church of Santa Croce, where we began our program today. And then it's into the narrow back alleys of the city. This part of Florence between the Palazzo Vecchio and the Duomo still retains much of its medieval character. Many of the buildings are 500 and 600 years old, and the street pattern reflects the grid system created during the late medieval and early Renaissance times. This peaceful cloister is attached to the Church of San Lorenzo, which was designed by Brunelleschi in the early Renaissance. He developed here a new theory of geometry and proportion based on humanistic canons of architectural beauty, rather than the flamboyant elements of the late Gothic period that had degenerated into more of a formalistic approach. The Renaissance, we see the emphasis on simple geometric forms. At the back of the church, we find the Medici Chapel. This is a mausoleum that holds the remains of 6 of the Medici rulers. It was designed in the early 1700s by the son of Cosimo I, and yet it took nearly 200 years to complete all the details, and the final touches were not added until this century. You see the large coffin sarcophaguses, and there's a huge dome that's somewhat reminiscent of the earlier Duomo by Brunelleschi. Frescoes on the interior painted in the early 19th century by Pietro Benvenuti. Now here's an inside tip. Be sure to walk behind the altar and take a right down a narrow corridor, because that will lead you to the bones of the saints. These rooms of reliquaries on each side of the altar are easily overlooked by the passing tourist, but they're well worth your while. Bones of the saints are felt by some to have curative powers and can help cleanse the soul. These reliquaries were presented to the church by Pope Clement VII. And whether or not you believe, these are fascinating items, and they are held in some very decorative vessels. Another fascinating room in the Church of San Lorenzo is the new sacristy. This was built by Michelangelo. He designed the architecture, and he also carved the statues. He created this funerary chapel for the Medici family in the 1520s and the 1530s. Here you see the Duke of Urbino in a pensive pose. He's the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and below him, the figures of dawn and dusk. On the other side of the chapel, we have the figures of day and night surmounted by the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Duke of Nemours. These are comparatively insignificant members of the Medici family, but they made wonderful subjects for the master Michelangelo to create some of his finest statues. So realistic you can see these characters still walking the streets of the city today. It's a contemplative spot, despite the small crowd of tourists who's ever present in the new sacristy. but it's a fitting climax to our visit to the Church of San Lorenzo. Piazza San Marco is one of the city's busiest. There's a bus stop here, there's a university on the square, interesting fountain in the middle, and the convent of San Marco and the Church of San Marco are also located right here. It's just on the edge of town, and if you're at the Accademia Museum, it's only a block away, so it might be worth your while. If you've wondered what the cathedral dome looks like inside, there is a small model with a cross-section that's found in the Museo del Duomo, which is located just behind the cathedral. And you can see the inner shell and the outer shell that was designed by Brunelleschi. This museum contains quite a few statues, as well as a lot of the artifacts from the construction of the cathedral dome. And the masterpiece here is Michelangelo's late Pietà. This was designed to go on his own tomb, but it never got there. Instead, it's been on exhibit in the main cathedral, and for the last 15 years, it's been here in the Museum of the Duomo. Another highlight is the playful series of wall friezes carved by Della Robbia. These originally were part of a choir loft in a church in Florence. And they illustrate with vivid, lifelike energy children making music, singing and dancing, playing with their musical instruments, and enjoying life. Some of the figures are drawn from classical models of ancient Greece and Rome, and they are exquisitely carved within their architectural frameworks. You can almost hear the music in stone. There's a similar series on another wall by Donatello, but not quite as happy or quite as lifelike. However, Donatello's masterpiece of Mary Magdalene is here. It's one of the oldest carved wooden sculptures still surviving from the early Renaissance. Another fascinating artifact are the original bronze doors of the baptistery carved by Ghiberti. They were outside on the baptistery doors for hundreds of years and have just recently been taken in. And now on the baptistery we see here the copies that were made by the Friuli Gallery. We were in the Friuli Gallery in our previous show, and they made copies from the original molds of the baptistery doors. And they look very nice and very clean. Here's Ghiberti himself in a self-portrait appearing in the middle of his own work, The Gates of Paradise. But the originals have even more beauty and more depth to them, more character. So go to the Museum of the Duomo if you have time. It's behind the cathedral. It's a small museum, and it has those exquisite treasures that will further enhance your trip to this art capital of Italy. It's the leather capital of Italy also. In Florence, you'll find leather-bound books, and you'll find some great shoes and bags and belts and gloves, and a whole variety of other kinds of stores. Here's an antique brass shop. It looks like it's been here for 400 years, and it probably has. Certainly the kinds of items that it has for sale here have been around for a long, long time, aside from the electrical light bulbs. Brass lanterns, brass pots and pans, antiques in all price categories. Perhaps you could find something very small and affordable to pack in your suitcase and take home. Rush hour here is fascinating to watch because it's much different from anything that you'll find back home. Right away you notice that nearly all the drivers are on two wheels. There's mopeds and bicycles and motorcycles and motor scooters of all sorts. And of course you've got cars and people riding buses. There's no subway in Florence. It's a rather small city, population under 1 million. So nearly all the commuters here get by on two wheels. And it's a great way to squeeze even more vehicles into these narrow streets. But watch your step as a pedestrian. They might not always watch where they're going here. This really only happens for about 45 minutes at rush hour in the evening and in the morning when it's quite so busy. Most of the day, Florence is rather peaceful, and in large parts of the city, there's no motor vehicles allowed at all. It's strictly for pedestrians. But watch your step at rush hour. And after rush hour, the city settles into twilight. Spotlights brighten the building facade, such as here at the Church of Santa Maria Novella.